Hey guys, I'm Norb.
And I'm Mike.
And we're the Watchmen.
The men who watch.
Because if it's on a screen, we're watching it and sharing our reviews of it with you.
So for this show, we are going to go back to the 80s and talk about our top 5 arcade games from that special time in our lives.
That's right. But before we do that, first I'd like to thank all of you who are watching us on YouTube. Please continue to do so. Hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell because it really helps us out.
And also, it's kind of exciting, Norb. We are now podcasting. How cool is that?
Mm-hmm. Yep,
so
that's right.
We want to acknowledge all you podcast listeners to thank you for listening into our show. And I just think this is great. I know many of you would prefer to listen than watch. And so we want to reach all of you, however way you would prefer to enjoy our show. So thanks for tuning in. And if you're, whatever you're using, Apple Podcasts or Google, there are so many choices.
Spotify.
So many choices, amazing.
Yeah.
Just be sure to give us a rating, subscribe, and share it with your friends.
That's right. So if you're listening and you want to watch us, you can hop to YouTube. And if you want to listen instead of watch, now you know you can find us both ways. So excited to be reaching you any way we can.
And it's great because if I have a bad hair day, anyone who's listening, you'll just never know.
Or if you want to see how bad it is, just go to YouTube and you can see how he looks without having a haircut for several weeks. Yep. So yeah, it's great. So we're enjoying getting our message, and we hope you guys continue to listen and enjoy what we're doing. So we enjoy talking about this particular topic, our favorite top 5 arcade video games from the 80s. Now, just so you guys know, every show, we never discuss in advance what our lists are. So we are actually finding out what our lists are as you do. So there's a little bit of element of surprise from not just for you, but also for us. So I'm excited to see how many games, we have in common and what surprises lie ahead. So Mike, why don't you start first?
And also, I want to, before I start on my list, Norb, I almost, sometimes I can close my eyes and take myself back to growing up in Selah, Washington, where the places to play arcade games were the Selah Family Fun Center, Bruno's Pizza, or the Selah 7-Eleven. And there was many a Saturday that I would ride my bike down the hill and hang out at one of those arcades. And I'd walk in the door and you could hear all the bleeps and bloops and blops of all the games. And I'd be so excited. I'd have my $1 in my pocket that I'd turn in for 4 quarters so I could play 4 games. And after that, I would spend about 3 hours and just watch other people play. And if no one was playing, I would just watch the attract sequences.
Well, and that's kind of the same with me too, because I didn't have a lot of money. Whatever money I had, it was from allowance or whatever, my parents were willing to let me use. So I spent more time watching how other people played than I did spending, the money and playing myself. But the arcade was definitely that magical place. Because I did have an Intellivision game console, but of course the quality was not close to what the arcade could offer. So we had places like, I think it was the Silver Coin down at South Center or the Gold Mine down at SeaTac Mall, where me and my buddy Rob, we'd go down there often and play games down there. But yeah, it brings back lots of good memories of where, unlike today, where you have awesome video games at your disposal on your phone, you have HD, amazing quality at your fingertips. Back then, you had to go spend money at the arcade to watch what was just okay graphics, but it was awesome at the time. So just the fact that, it's hard for I think the younger people these days to appreciate how desperate we wanted to play those games in the arcade. It was the only place you could do it. And so it really was a special time that's very different to relate to what it is like now. But for those of you who remember the 80s and remember those days of going to the arcade, maybe some of these games on our list will bring back some fond memories of yours. And of course, we'd love to hear from you feedback what your favorite games are that we didn't put on our list.
Well, and back then too, what I remember is a lot like today. Some things don't change. You still have to wait for things. Sometimes you have to get in line, and sometimes things are all sold out. And when I would go to the 7-Eleven, I'd usually have about 4 quarters, and I'd be thinking for hours, I want to play Asteroids. I can't wait. I'd ride my bike down the hill, and I'd go into the 7-Eleven, and all the high school kids would be crowded around the Asteroids machine, and they would have their quarters lined across the top, and there'd be like 20 quarters lined across the top, and that was the way of dibsing the next game. You basically say, I've got all these games because I put my money on the machine. And I'd walk in and I'd think, I'm not going to get a play. and I was so bummed. I mean, I and it was a lot of work to ride my bike there and everything, and I was sad. Remember, I'd have to leave dejected, like those high school kids that keep taking all the games and won't let us play.
And those games would last, for those guys who are really good, that quarter would last a long time, too. So you see like 5, 6, 7 quarters, you're going, man, it's going to be like a couple hours before these guys get through. So again, the challenges of back in the day, you just couldn't hop on and play. It was hard enough just to get there. And then if you're lucky enough to have money, you still couldn't play because everybody else was trying to play. It was a crazy, crazy time. But man, it was magical at the same time, too.
Yeah, that's why I kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit before we started, because I feel like it tries to at least give a time and place to things, especially for younger listeners that didn't grow up during this time.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Yeah, everybody, I think, have seen the games. You can play them now. You can download all the emulators of those games. But to understand the context of what made it special to actually go down and, travel to go play these games was definitely something that represented our childhood back in junior high, high school. And
a lot of the times you didn't know what games were going to be coming. There was no movie trailers, trailers for arcade games. So you just go into the arcade and start looking to see what was new. And that was exciting too. I mean, again, there were sequels to games made. So you'd walk in and see that game title with a 2 next to it. And it was like going to a new movie. You'd start watching the screen and see what they did and try to figure out. It was like a new story unfolding.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So,
well, shall we jump into the list? Mike, go ahead with your 5th.
My number 5 is an arcade game called Spy Hunter. Norb, do you remember Spy Hunter?
I didn't play it much. I do remember it. I think I actually remember the arcade artwork more than I remember the game. It had kind of a guy's face with like a crosshairs or something, if I'm not mistaken. It
was a James Bond type game where you were in a James Bond car. Your car had shotgun weapons, and it had a smoke screen. It had oil slick powers. You could do things to fight the bad guy cars, and it's a race. So you have a steering wheel, a gear shift, and then you had buttons that would basically use your powers, like your smoke screen. Now, you didn't have these things at your start. You had to drive and find what's called a weapons van. And the weapons van would have a picture of like a white cloud on it. So you knew that was a smoke screen, and you'd have to drive into it, and then you'd come out and you'd have smoke screen. And of course that would only last for a certain amount of time. So it was like living as a real life James Bond in an arcade game. But what was really cool about Spy Hunter is that they licensed the Peter Gunn theme. You know that song? Dun 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 dun. So that was not usually done in arcade games, and that made it unique. And also just the music itself that would play when I'd leave the mini mart where they had that game, I'd still have that song going through in my head. And so of course that made me want to go back and play the game some more. I think that was good marketing thinking on their part, because it really helped that game to stick in my brain after I'd run out of quarters.
Yeah, isn't that the part where the theme goes na na?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. That was, yep. All right, good number 5.
Well, and one thing I'll add too is I would talk about these games with kids at school, and one kid, I was telling him how much I liked these. He says, yeah, did you know that if you get far enough, you actually can become a speedboat, and you're on water, and your oil slick becomes flames? And I had no idea. It didn't say anything in the directions, and so I worked really hard at it, and I finally got into the speedboat shack, and it was the coolest thing. All of a sudden, your oil slick is flames. You could flame all the boats behind you. So it was word of mouth that even you learned about, if you got far enough, the new things that could happen.
Pretty much everything back then was word of mouth, because there was no internet to fill us in on what was going on. So yeah, that is true. All right, well, to start my list, at number 5 is the video game Joust. Joust actually has a special relevance to our lives. We actually owned a Joust machine at a time when we had our Quantum Productions studio. We got a couple of arcade games, and one of them was Joust, because we both loved that game as well. Joust was, to me, a very unique game, because it's one of those few games where there's not any shooting or firing anything. You're literally just on top of an flying ostrich, and you fight other people on ostriches. It could be a 1 or 2 player game, and the goal was to hit the other ostrich, and you have to be higher than that ostrich. And if you're higher, you kill that person, and then and then an egg comes out, and then you have to try to get the egg before it hatches into another bad guy. And that's basically kind of the story. So it just gets more and more crazier with more and more ostriches. And then a pterodactyl flies around, and it tries to, it's very hard to kill, but it's very deadly. So we own that game, as I said, but I played that quite a bit, and I just thought it was really cool because it was such a unique concept where you didn't have to shoot anything. You just try to position yourself, and then it had a very good way of depicting the gravity as you're flying around. You have to flap your wings and try to fly, and then the eggs would fall out and bounce around. You have to snag them. So I always loved just the way they designed that interface.
Yeah, that had a lot of button mashing because to flap, you had to really press the button really, really fast to flap your wings.
But you can't go too fast, because if you go too fast, you go too high. So you got to hovering is like so there's a touch, very very certain touch to it. But yeah, game that never gets old for me.
What was neat about that game too is that it was a 2-player game where you could play with a friend, and a lot of times you'd either each take a side, or someone say, okay, I'm going to take the top section, you take the bottom. Yeah. And if you ever landed on top of your friend, you'd get a 1,000-point bonus for killing him. But I never wanted to play with friends where we'd try to kill each other because the quarters were just too precious.
Yeah. And that was one of those continue games, one of the new wave of continue games where you could, I think you could continue, right? Oh, no, actually, no, you couldn't. You just had extra guys. You got extra guys, but once you're out of guys, it was done. Never mind. But still, yeah, the point was it's much more better to cooperate. You actually got points for cooperative play, too. So, yeah, it was always fun to play with a friend and try to, work as a team. But inevitably, you hit your own guy, your friend on accident. Sorry, didn't mean to kill you. And then he gets pissed at you. So that would happen anyway. It's hard not to have that happen. But I have to say, for me, these video games on my list, they're definitely ones where how I approached this was if I walk into an arcade back then, when I would walk into an arcade, or if I go to an arcade now, or like your guys' Mike's group who has a video game and pinball show, it's the games where I need to go find this machine and play it. It's on my must-play list. So that's how I kind of determined what was on my list. Because there's so many good games, but it's kind of that I don't feel complete if I didn't play this game. So that's how I came up with my top 5. So
well, and again, I have so many arcade games I loved, and I couldn't put them on the list. Joust is not one on my list, but a great game. And I tried to pick ones that had some personal meaning to me in my past. And one last thing I'll say about Joust is Joust actually was a little creepy to me back then because of the lava troll. That was just this hand that would come out of the lava. So if you got too close to the lava, this hand would come out and grab your bird's legs and just suck it down into the lava of death. Yeah. And there's always something creepy about when it's just a hand. You kind of don't know what this monster looks like.
If you flapped hard enough, the hand, you slip out of its grasp and you can escape. Yeah. But if you get too close to it, it just reaches up and grabs you and you're like, ah! And sometimes you can get away, sometimes it pulls you and you die. So yeah, that was pretty cool. I love that little creepy little hidden thing down below. You never know what's lurking. So all right, that's Joust number 5 for me. So number 4, Mike.
My number 4, just to give a time and place, we'd go to Wenatchee, Washington a lot when I was growing up. That's where my grandparents and aunts and uncles lived. And when we go there, I'd ask my parents if they would just drop me off at the arcade at the mall, and I would spend 3-4 hours just hanging around. It was more fun than sitting on the couch at my grandparents' house with nothing good on TV. So that was where I first saw a game called Crazy Climber. Oh, yeah. And this was really different because most arcade games, it was usually a joystick and some buttons and you'd go left, right, up, down, fire, flap. It was pretty typical for game design. But Crazy Climber, you were this guy and your job was you had to climb a building from the outside. So you'd scale it with your hands and feet to the top. And through that process, there'd be all kinds of obstacles to avoid, like evil faces would try to drop pots on you, and there'd be King Kong would try to punch you when you go by him, and windows would be constantly opening and closing. So if a window closed on your hands, you could fall. But the way you navigated him is you had 2 joysticks, and it was like your hands and feet. So you'd go like this. You'd go up, down, opposite arms and hands, and that was the way the guy kind of climbed. And the other cool thing is it was one of the early games that had the digitized speech, and we kind of laugh about because he would say things like, "Go for it," but instead of "go for it," it was it was that kind of raspy,
bad digital quality version because they didn't have a lot of memory, so they couldn't have high quality samples. It was like the lowest possible sample that you could understand.
So when if you get to the very top of the building, there's a helicopter. And when you grab it, he lets out a big, "Wah!" like a joy scream, but instead it was, and there'd be a song that would play. And but I was just fascinated with that game. I don't know, did you play Crazy Climber much?
No, that was one of I watched it. I was a watchman watching that game, but I didn't play it much. It's funny, though, the way you describe it. I think in the movie Wreck-It Ralph, wasn't he kind of inspired a little bit by the way he climbed around like Crazy Climber a little bit?
Maybe. Fix-It Felix would move from window to window, and I think there would be like pies he'd get, and he would try to, Wreck-It Ralph would try to hit him with bricks. So I think it was a little more like Donkey Kong, King Kong style. But I mean, Felix did definitely climb around the outside of a building and you know, battle with Ralph, so a little bit. But Crazy Climber was made by a Japanese company, and all the buildings had Japanese names on them. So they were all titled after buildings in Japan. So there was no Empire State Building or anything that we would know. They always had Japanese names, and I thought that was kind of interesting because I had no idea what it was.
Right.
So
very cool. So to my list, number 4 is the video game Star Wars. And I'm excited now because I recently got the mini version of that they're now making. What do you call those? The Arcade Up.
It's an Arcade One-Up version.
One-Up. So they're smaller. They're not the real video games, but they're basically simulations in a smaller scale, but they still have some cabinetry. So I actually have that. I'll have to show it someday. But it's in my house, so it's a joy now to actually have that game, you know, personally close by. But Star Wars was awesome because, one, big Star Wars fans, of course, but it was just very unique. It had the vector graphics type of imagery, like what you see in Asteroids. You know, it's the lines. Everything's transparent, but it's just the shape of everything in lines. But what was so cool about that game was, one, you have this really cool joystick. It's not even a joystick. It's like a fighter pilot. What do you call that control? It's got
it's called a yoke controller.
Yoke controller. So it's like a steering wheel, like an airplane, you know, type of steering wheel. And you go up and down. You got your triggers up here on the front and the top. And what was great about it is you got John Williams' digital score playing throughout. It sounds like it's a calculator playing the music, but it's still pretty cool. And then it had voice samples. You had "The Force will be with you always."
Except it was
yeah, but it was better. It was better than Crazy Climber. But woo! Let's blow this thing and go home. You know, so it had all those samples from Star Wars, and then again the kind of calculator quality music score in the background. But just that whole dynamic, I played that so much as a kid, and so again, that was one of those ones, especially with the controller. Just a game that I always have to play whenever I see it, and now I can because it's right over there. So I love that game, and glad I now have a chance to own it. Thanks to you telling me about that. So.
See, a lot like how I remember what theater I saw a really good movie in. I remember where I first saw an 80s arcade game that had an impression on me. And Star Wars I first saw at a little mini mart in Leavenworth, Washington. We were there on summer vacation for a week with the family, and it was across the street in the mini mart. And I remember I stood there for hours and just watched kids play. And like you said, it was like playing Star Wars. It was so cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, classic.
So moving on to my number 3, this was a game that I first saw in Kings Row, which is a local burger joint in Seattle, Washington that is still there today. And they still put one game in the corner like they did back when I was growing up. But this is a game that really needs no introduction. It's Donkey Kong, a game that has spurred so much from the beginnings. Everyone knows who Mario is. A billion Mario games. However, in Donkey Kong, his name wasn't Mario. He was just called the Plumber. But Donkey Kong is is I love platform games, and Donkey Kong is representative of a platform game where you have to climb platforms by using ladders or running, jumping, and avoid obstacles to get to the top. And you're always trying to get to the top to save the damsel in distress from Donkey Kong. So it's very King Kong style, and again, a Japanese design game. Really, most of the games came from Japan. I think about it. You know, there were some that came out of Chicago, like Spy Hunter did, but Donkey Kong is easily my top three. Just because not only did I love the game, but I feel it's important in history as to what came about it. The funny thing is, in the arcade world, the redheaded stepchild of Donkey Kong is always Donkey Kong 3, because you're this guy fighting bugs with a bug sprayer, but the guy is not Mario. He's just a guy, and it's always weird. It's like Donkey Kong's in it, but it's the one game without Mario. It's a strange one. So.
Well, Donkey Kong is Donkey Kong is my number 2 on my list, so I'm with you. It's definitely near the tops. I would have to say this is probably the game that, while it's not number 1, it's definitely the game I played the most. Just because it was everywhere. I remember playing it a lot. We went on a cruise back in middle school, junior high, and they had an arcade with some games in it, but Donkey Kong was like the first one. You walk through the door and it's right there. And I played a lot of money. My parents would go to the casino and gamble, and they'd give us like $20 to go to the arcade. I could make that $20 last forever. So a lot of it went to Donkey Kong. And yeah, that's one of those games where I got pretty good at it. I would never say I was great, but I could definitely get past the Pie Factory, which is always the challenge. That's like a level 5 or 6, I think.
Yeah.
Not every time, but I could get to the Pie Factory. But mostly it's because I'd watch other people play. And that's one of those games where if you mimic someone else's pattern and moves, you can do just as good as somebody else. It's not one of those games where you have to the pattern's changing constantly. It's like, up, jump that barrel, go over here, up that ladder, jump, grab the hammer. There's a very specific pattern, and you can get good at it. And that was one of those games that I was able to watch so many times other people playing, and then I applied that myself. So yeah, for all the reasons you described, I own this game in television, again, on my game console at home. It looked like garbage.
It looked like garbage.
It was okay. I remember I was so jealous though, because Atari had a version of it and it was really bad. And television had a version and it looked like just a really half version of what the original one was. And then ColecoVision came out, version. And they had the commercial. And I was like, oh my God, it looks almost exactly like the arcade game. I was so envious. I wanted to drop my television right there and get the ColecoVision just so I could have a close to arcade version of Donkey Kong, because it looks so good. But regardless, I played it a lot at home as well. Not as rewarding, but it was a game that definitely I spent a lot of my life putting my money and my time into, but no regrets, because that game is still to this day a lot of fun.
That reminds me of a great story about the ColecoVision version of Donkey Kong. I have a magazine I subscribe to called Retro Gamer, and they interviewed the guy whose job was to get the licensing rights for ColecoVision from Nintendo, and he was an American, obviously, and he had to travel to Japan, and apparently, he said he got there, and before his meeting, they put him in this big room at a little table all by himself, and he had to sit there for hours. And I guess that was a Japanese negotiating technique where they would basically make you uncomfortable and make you wait, to where by the time they would talk with you, you would already be a little flustered and a little kind of outside of your normal confident self, and then they would commence negotiations. So, but Smart he said move. We pretty much were going to just take whatever, we were going to pay them whatever they wanted to charge, because we knew that if we could get this, it would sell our system. And he was right.
Yeah. Well, it's a great game. It's a great game. And like I said, started the entire Mario, franchise, which, is bigger than, that's Nintendo for you. So yeah, that's your number 3. So I go into my number 3, another vector graphics game from Atari, the game Tempest. Tempest, again, was one of those games. It was also, I think where I really got into it was that same cruise ship where they had the Donkey Kong over here when you walked in and Tempest was to the left. And I think that was where I discovered it. I had not seen Tempest before. And I was like, what is this? What is this controller and this
spinner.
This spinner that moves like this? This is something else. You know, for those of you who haven't played it, it's unique because it does have that transparent line type graphics like Star Wars and Asteroids. But it was cool. Again, a cool concept where you're just this yellow, they're kind of like a really jaggedy Pac-Man, but you go down these patterned tubes and try to shoot everything that's coming at you. And if they get past to the end and reach to the end, well, you got to find out some way to survive. And every time you can clear a level, you zoom into the next one and continue fighting more until you can just get further and further along. This game was, at the time, again, it just visually revolutionary because I hadn't seen a pattern type shooting game like that before, and I still feel like not many have been imitated like that. And so it stands alone in terms of just the style of the way you just that dynamic of playing that type of game. But just the spinner, the way you spun the guy around from side to side, very unique. No joystick, just a spinner and a fire button, and then a smart bomb, I think is what it calls, smart bomb, or super zapper button to shoot everything that's in the thing when you get desperate. But I spent a lot of time on that game, and thanks again to Mike, who's the video game, connection to everything that's coming out. He got me a little tabletop version with a little LCD screen. It's really tiny, like barely the size of a cell phone, but it's got a little spinner on it and a fire button. It's basically an arcade game squashed down to 1/10 size or 1/20th size. And it's awesome because the sounds are exactly the same and it plays the same. So I get to play with Tempest at home too. And what's funny is, not that they're in my house, I hardly ever play them. But when I do get the itch, I can go over and just do it. So that's number 3 on my list, Tempest.
Sometimes it's just fun to just listen to the sounds again and just kind of go back in time for a short bit. Tempest is not on my list, but a great game. It was kind of dubbed a 3D version of Space Invaders, if you think about it. It's vector, and the Space Invaders are just coming out at you in 3D, and you're moving around a forced path, and you have to just keep killing them.
Yeah, they're on a grid. Yeah, on a patterned grid. Yeah, that makes sense. Space Invaders on a patterned grid coming at you, 3D. Yeah, that's a good description. All right, so now we're to number 2.
My number 2 is one of the few games that sits at the Smithsonian, and it's a story about a adventurer trying to rescue a princess from a dragon. And the adventurer's name is Dirk the Daring. So you're probably wondering who Dirk the Daring is? Well, he's on my t-shirt. Right there. Dirk the Daring. He is a bumbling, everyday fool who's just trying to do the right thing and help the princess from the evil clutches of the dragon, whose name is Singe. Now, what's really special about Dragon's Lair is it was actually a Laserdisc game that used real animation created by a famous animator named Don Bluth. And it was a game where you had to make decisions on where to take Dirk through the castle rooms when things would always be happening. There'd be snakes, weird creatures, traps, and you had to think quick. So it was a quick time event, we call it, kind of game where you have to make quick decisions, and if you make the wrong decision, you die. If you make the right decision, you move forward to the next decision-making spot. And the Laserdisc would be slow to access, so a lot of times you'd make a move and there'd be a pause. But it was also the very first arcade game to cost 50 cents instead of 25 cents. And that was a big deal for people like us who had very few quarters. So I watched a lot of people play that game. And the great thing about Dragon's Lair, it was just as fun to watch as to play.
Yeah, same thing. Was not on my list because I rarely played it, but I watched it a lot. I listened to it a lot, could hear it, beckoning me to come watch it, and I got more out of it. I think I tried to play it a couple times. I was so terrible, and I thought watching that 2 quarters go down the drain in like 30 seconds was not worth it for me. I was like, no, give me those 2 quarters. I'll make my other games last for a lot longer. But yeah, I spent a lot of time watching it. It was cool. It was cool the fact that you're watching this cartoon basically playing out and changing before your eyes. But yeah, it was pretty novel at the time to see something like that, which we'd never seen before. So
and I would watch a lot of kids come up and try to play that game, and they would usually never get very far. You died a lot.
Because you only had one option. There wasn't a
Yeah.
lot of dodging things in real time. It was like, you must act this way at that particular spot, and if you're too early or too late, it's over, and you only had
Yeah.
3 lives, I think, or whatever. But so yeah, it was precise, and you had to be right on the money. And so the only way you got that good is to watch a lot, or really watch a lot, watch what they were doing and imitate them. But again, too much money to spend, so it's a lot easier to just watch somebody else do it who was good at it.
Well, it was a memory-based game, and so you had to learn the moves, but then you also had to learn the timing, and sometimes the timing could be off. But there was this one moment in my life where I was at Bruno's Pizza, and this guy, he was like a high school kid. He started playing the game, and I was watching him. I didn't know who he was, so I'm just watching, and I realized he was actually pretty good. And then he actually got to the dragon's lair.
Wow.
And I
don't think I've
remember,
ever seen it.
I mean, my mouth was hanging open. I mean, I'd never seen anybody get there. And I remember he not just got there, he was actually winning. And he beat the game. He
Wow.
actually saved the princess. And it ended where she gave him a big hug and this heart appeared. And then that was just it. It just ended. I remember I was speechless.
Watching history.
and he kind of just, the game was over, and I remember he kind of took a step back and kind of looked at me, and I think there was someone else watching, and I didn't know what to say to him. He didn't say anything, and he just kind of walked off. And it was like he vanished into some cloud of mist. In my lifetime, that's the only time I ever saw someone beat it, and it was just incredible.
I've never seen the ending of that game, but I would love to, if I could have gone back to that time and see that guy, I'd like to ask, how much money do you invest to become good enough to get to the end? Because that had to have been a small fortune to play that game enough to become that good at it, to actually win that game. That's pretty cool.
He probably went to all the different arcades and just, put on a show for everybody.
Yeah, like, let me show you how it's done.
Because once you could beat it, I think you could beat it probably pretty consistently.
Right.
But
It's
yeah, I
all
bet he
the
put a
wrist.
few quarters in that game to learn that.
Yep.
So,
All right, well, I already did my number 2, which was Donkey Kong. So I guess, should we just go back to you, go to your number 1, and I'll finish with my number 1?
go ahead. Why don't you go with your number one
I'll
first?
go with my number 1. Okay,
It
well,
might be mine.
I doubt it, but
Okay.
we'll see. The hint has been all over this show because I'm wearing my number 1, the game Gorf, right here. There it is, baby, Gorf. Gorf is a game that is special to me because, one, you don't find it that often. It's kind of a rare one to find. And I remember discovering this game on, we were on a cruise, a vacation in the Caribbean with my parents in 6th grade, I believe. No, maybe 7th grade. And I remember it was one of those times my parents were at the casino and we were out to go kill some time on our own. And I discovered this, it was a tabletop, the cocktail table version of Gorf. And I love this game because Gorf is one where it's basically, I can't remember, it's 5 or 6 games in one. You start with Space Invaders, and then you go to this game called
Galaxian.
No, the Galaxian was the third one. The second
Okay.
one was like Space. I can't remember what is it. The thing where these guys are just flying around and they come at you. Galaxians, and then there was. I can't believe I'm forgetting all the levels.
Well,
And
the
then
mothership
flagship.
battle.
Galaxian and the mothership. I'm missing one.
There was a TIE fighter
No,
in one part.
well,
would
it
go
looks
around
kind of like it looks
loop.
kind of like one. Anyway, point is, what's cool about it is you got to play multiple games. So as you cleared one, you get to the next one. Then you finish that, get to the next one, and then you fight the mothership. If you get that, you start back over, but it's much more difficult. And I was pretty good at that game. I took to it right away. It had a joystick, but it was a trigger flight type joystick. So what was nice is, unlike Space Invaders or Galaxian, where you can only move left and right, you can actually move left, right, and forward and back. And that made it easier for me because I was terrible at Galaxians, but I was good at this Galaxians on Gorf because I had the ability to move up and down. And so I just took to this game right away. I enjoyed, I played it pretty well, and it just had another one of those games with, it had a digitized voice on there. It was the robot leader taunting you. It'll even say stuff when you're not playing just to get your attention. Insert coin,
He can do that really well.
Bad move, Space Cadet. So these sounds are just ingrained in my being because I played it and heard it so many times. But I wish I had that game. I wish I had a tabletop sitting out there. But this is one that if I go someplace and they've got arcade games from the 80s, I'm always looking to see, do they have Gorf? Do they have Gorf? In Mike's annual pinball and arcade show, I'm always asking, do they have Gorf this year? Do they have Gorf this year? Because if it's there, I'm playing it for a while. So that is number 1, baby. Gorf.
Well, Gorfa's not my number one, but also a great game. I used to play that at the local grocery store in Selah. Once again, I remember where all these games were. So my number one is about a yellow guy who just wants to eat dots, and he occasionally likes to eat some fruit, and he's constantly running from ghosts. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I don't know what planet you live on, but it's Pac-Man. And the reason I picked Pac-Man as my greatest arcade game of all time is because Pac-Man changed the idea of what arcade games could be. Before Pac-Man, most arcade games were a type of a space shooter. You're some ship shooting something in space. Pac-Man was a story. It was about this yellow guy who was trying to eat dots and survive from ghosts and get to the next level. And then fruits would show up and they were bonus points. And you'd eat energizers and the ghosts would turn blue and you'd have to chase them down and get points. That just didn't exist. And not only that, Pac-Man was the first arcade game to ever have an intermission. So if you got through the second level, you'd get this little intermission with a song, and it was just a Pac-Man running across the stream from a ghost, where Norb would, of course, yell, "Dead right there!"
Right?
Yeah, dead right there.
Dead right there. Because when he chased it, the thing came back, and he got him right at the end.
Got too close.
Dead right there. Anyway.
So
inside joke.
When I first saw Pac-Man, I felt like the world had changed. It was kind of how I felt when I came out of RoboCop. I talked about that in an earlier show. But the world had changed, and I have to admit that Pac-Man was the first game that made me sacrifice my lunch money to play it after school. And I felt really bad about that. I mean, my mom would give me $1 for lunch, and I skipped lunch, and I played 4 games of Pac-Man. I only did it a couple times because the guilt just overtook me, and I couldn't keep doing it. But I wanted to play it so bad. I would talk about it to anyone who would listen to me. So Pac-Man is definitely my number one because it was probably the most memorable video game experience I ever had.
Yeah. Well, and I think probably whenever somebody says 80s video game, Pac-Man would be the first thing to pop up on, what's the first game to come to my mind? Would be Pac-Man. I played that one a lot. Obviously, when it first hit the scene, it was definitely unique. The music, and the sound effects, I mean, all that stuff was, so iconic and recognizable even today. And I don't think there's not anybody who probably hasn't played Pac-Man at some point, even by accident on some kind of app on a phone or a screen or something on a computer. So that game the only thing about that game was I was never very good at it. I could get to a certain point, but I never memorized the maps enough to be very good at where you can go level after level. And again, this is before the days of being able to just put another quarter in and continue. So, sometimes you get frustrated where I was like, not good at this. But definitely when it first came out, it was one of those games where it just drew you to the arcade. And we'll never forget seeing that and hearing that for the first time. It definitely was one of those. It's when I think of the first games in an arcade, Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, I got the side by side of the two that draw me to. That's what I remember as my early, Asteroids 2. Those three are kind of like the ones that you always saw them, always at the arcade. So you can always count on that. Your friendly sounds of Pac-Man to be greeting you, whether you played it or not. So,
well, I actually got very good at Pac-Man, which actually leads into a good segue into my surprise. I do have an honorable mention. Do you have an honorable mention?
I do have an honorable mention.
Okay, so I think just for the sake of a good segue, I'm going to segue into the surprise, and then let's come back to the honorable mentions.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Because you talked about how you were never very good at Pac-Man.
Right.
I probably got better at Pac-Man than I ever got at any other game, and there's a reason for that. So another one of the great things about Pac-Man is it spawned the first ever video game song album ever made.
Oh, right.
And I've got it right here to show you. It is Pac-Man Fever by Buckner and Garcia. And again, this was another thing. They came out with this song called Pac-Man Fever, and it became a hit. And so they got signed with a record company, and they quickly had to write and cram out 9 more songs about video games so they could have an album to push into stores. So they wrote songs on Defender, Centipede, Frogger, and they're the cheesiest 80s songs you'd ever hear, but they're so fun to listen to. They have great bass riffs. They're just good little melodies. Good. Every song has a theme. You can't help but sing along with them. Nobody probably ever listens to these. I actually know them all pretty well. I could even quote to you lyrics from most of those songs. You know, I'll fight this day to the end. I'm a captain of the ship and its men. I'm the defender.
You sang the Pac-Man Fever song at a karaoke thing.
At a karaoke band, I sang Pac-Man
Probably
Fever.
no one ever chooses that song,
but they could play
you. That was hilarious.
So the Pac-Man Fever album is not only great because of the music, but also when you bought the record, and again, back when you bought a record in the 80s, you had to think carefully about spending your hard-earned money on that, because I didn't have much back then. But inside the record, they actually had Pac-Man patterns.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. So you could learn how to get up to the 9th key. And there's a famous line in the song where he says, I got all the patterns down up until the 9th key.
Yep.
Do. So these patterns, I studied them like I would study homework for school. And I took this sheet into the arcade game with me, and I would secretly try to put it out. I'd folded it up, and I'd pull it on I was afraid the owner of the arcade would like see me and think I'm cheating or something. So I would I practiced. Cards. I memorized them, and then I practiced, and I got good enough to where I could get up to the 9th key. And after the 9th key, there's nothing you can do. It becomes random and it becomes difficult. The energizers don't ever turn the ghost blue. So I got good at it, but I really owe that to the patterns from the album I bought.
I never knew this. I can't believe you never told me this before. I'm shocking, breaking news. But, it's funny because we used to play it on the PC emulator back when we were roommates in the house and our business just starting. But I don't remember you ever getting up to the 9th key back then.
Well, I forgot all the patterns.
You must have lost all your memory.
Short-term memory.
Because I never saw you get even to 1 key when we would play. So
well, in all
only
defense,
lasted for a while.
Emulated games like what we played were not the same as the arcade. They were redesigned, so even my patterns wouldn't have worked. Interesting.
Okay. So, wow, that's cool. I learned some new stuff that I hadn't known before. Okay, well, I guess I'll go into my honorable mention. I don't know, who knows? This might be yours too, but this is another game that we owned for a while along with Joust, and that was the video game Tron. We actually talked about Tron in one of our other shows, and you will get to see it at some point if you haven't already. But the Tron video game, again, was one of those times where it came out right after the movie did, and the movie had such an impact on me at that age because of the whole video game era, and it was all about the computer and living in a computer in the day of the arcades and computers coming out. And that game was fun. It had the light cycles, it had the tanks, it had the MCP cone. We had to blast the little colored blocks out of there, and the little thing where you had the spiders you had to shoot and then go up into the IO tower. And it had the music from the movie. Again, anytime they had the music in the movie, it was so cool. And the music in Tron was already amazing. And then they had this kind of digitized version. And that was just happy feelings from that. And yes, we did own that game for a while, so we played it quite a bit. But that was my honorable mention, the game Tron.
Tron is not my honorable mention. Great game. I will have to say, I love Tron, and yes, we owned it, and it's great. But the one thing about the Tron video game, I mean, they had a big section with the grid bugs, which was just a toss-away moment in the movie. And then the section in the video game where you have to fight the MCP cone and shoot the blocks, that never happened in the movie. So the light cycles part was great, and the tank part was pretty good too. But I remember
You did have to remember. At the end of the movie, Tron is trying to throw his disc into the thing, and the MCP guy is blocking it. That was supposed to be what it's demonstrating. I know it's not exactly the way that they did it, and you're right. The grid bugs appeared for like 2 seconds, maybe 3, and they made a whole section of the video game out of this grid bugs part, which had nothing to do with the movie, but or nothing significant in the movie. But nonetheless, it was still Tron, the cabinetry, and it had a black light in the front. That's probably what made it the coolest. Is
Probably
that
the best designed cabinet ever for a video game.
It had some clips or images from the movie on the side, but it was that high contrast black with red and blue and the black light, so everything glowed. That's what I think was half the draw of that game. Yeah, however, it was the game, but just the design of what's on the cabinet was the allure to that game.
So my honorable mention is somewhat personal. It's a video game that also I think has an important place in history from what it did, but it also created a friendship for me. And that's what makes q-bert so special as a video game. So if you haven't heard of q-bert, it's a game that's a 3D looking triangular playing field, and you're this guy with a big nose and eyes, and you have to hop around and avoid weird snakes and creatures and turn all the blocks the other color. And once you do that, you complete the pyramid and you move on to the next level. But what was cool about q-bert, he had a personality. He was a character. When if you fall off, he'd go, ah, and you hear this splat. But the coolest thing about q-bert is that if he got hit, he'd have a little cartoon balloon that would come over his head, and it would have like the @ symbol, the number sign symbol, an exclamation point, basically to signify that he was angry and possibly cursing. No one really knows what he said because it was just a bunch of garbly-gook ASCII code. But when he would do that, his voice would go, and since playing q-bert, I have become good friends with David Thiel, who was the sound designer on that q-bert game, and he has so many great stories about how when q-bert would curse, that was just a bunch of random code put into the sound chip, and it would be different every time. So every time he died, it'd be a slightly different. And David told me that they got letters from angry moms sent to Gottlieb, who made the game, saying that they were convinced that game was teaching their kids to swear.
Jeez. Wow.
So q-bert is special to me, not only for what it did for games at the time, where you had this character with a personality that swore like no character did, but since then I've gotten to know David Thiel over the last 10 years because he's helped us with our arcade show. He does a lot of sound for pinball machines. And we actually play a video game together called Borderlands 3, and I have to thank David for getting me into this game. But David has become a good friend, and there are moments that when we play together in Borderlands, I think to myself, it's so cool that I'm playing with the guy who did the sound for q-bert. Because back then I was just a 12-year-old kid, and when I would play q-bert and watch it in the arcades, I never would have thought I'd become friends with the person who did the sound for this game. I mean, David at the time was just in his young 20s, so he was just 5-6 years older than me, but he was old enough to be in the working world and using his music skills with technology to do really cool things for video games. So that's why q-bert is a very special honorable mention to me. Is there anything you want to say about q-bert, Norb?
I wish I could add to that. That was one of those games I did not play much. I didn't even really watch it much. It just didn't quite pull me in like it did you. I would see it and go, huh, okay, move along, move along. I had Gorf and Donkey Kong and Tempest to get to, so I didn't spend a lot of time on q-bert. But it's pretty cool that half of his name is half of my name, the Bert side of things. So that's about the connection. Norbert, q-bert, we had that shared common thing. But it's pretty cool how you and David became friends after that. You know, like you said, you go back to those days, and if you were to go back to the future and walk up to yourself in an arcade and say, hey, you enjoy that q-bert game? Yeah, it's pretty fun. I enjoy it. Guess what? You're going to be friends with the guy who did the sound, just so you know. Really? So it's pretty cool how life takes those turns. But so anyway.
Along the lines of that, just to wrap things up, I actually have been doing some thinking about this, Norb, and I have a challenge for you.
Oh.
So,
okay.
No question that this show is being done in a time of home quarantine due to the current situation of affairs in the world. And there is never going to be, I think, another time in history, Norb, where you will have time to play video games at home.
I am playing more video games and watching more movies than I ever have in a long time, so I agree.
I have been playing a lot of Borderlands 3, not just with David, but I play it with my son. Borderlands 3 is one of the best shooters ever made. And the reason is because it is so cleverly designed, and it's got the best writing I've ever experienced in a video game. It makes fun of itself, doesn't take itself seriously. There are so many funny characters. There's so many pop culture references. It is beyond the ability to count. And I've been playing a lot of it, and there's been moments in this game that have been moments of chill for me, where I have chills because it's like experiencing a really great movie where I think I'm never going to forget this moment. And
wow.
So, Norb, I want to ask you on the air if you would consider playing this game with me. So you could experience what I've been experiencing, and we could do it together, because Borderlands is a game meant to be played with somebody. It's designed to be shared, and it's co-op. So you play together. You don't play against each other. But right. I'm going to ask you, I don't think there would ever be another time in your life where I could even ask you.
Okay, well, on this platform, how could I say no? No. Yeah, no, I'd give it a try. This is definitely the time. I've been playing, as you know, I've been telling you, I've been playing a lot of my favorite game, which is Grand Theft Auto 5, playing it online. I've been playing the solo mode and campaign mode and just wandering around mode for years, and only now, just this past weekend, got into the online mode, and all of a sudden I'm just like reinvigorated by what I can do in this game playing with others. And so I'll tell you what, if I'll play Borderlands 3 if you hop on with some GTA 5 missions with me.
I would do that, of course.
So yes, I will check it out.
And then we can do a review show on Borderlands 3 once you've played it to all the way through. Then we can do a show on it, because it's worthy of a show. Okay,
well then only if I get to talk about GTA 5 at some point. So, all right, you have a deal. Do we have a deal? All right, we'll do it. I guess I know what I'm going to be doing on some of my spare time here, playing Borderlands 3. We'll talk about how to get that set up off air. But for now, this wraps up our top 5 80s arcade video games. Before we sign off, I just want to remind you, if you guys want to hear about any other movies, TV shows, or games, or whatever you'd like us to talk about, feel free to send us a message or put it in the comments. I'm Norb.
And I'm Mike.
And we are The Watchmen.
Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for watching The Watchmen.
Please click on here to watch other episodes, and be sure to hit that like button too.
And please subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way you'll always be alerted to any future episodes.
It really helps us out, and we appreciate it.
We'll see you next time. And remember, we'll be watching.